Hello, how are you? It's me, your narrator for Sleepless Nights, ready to dive into yet another monotonous story in the Boring History for Sleep series. Today, we're going to demystify the idea that Viking Age people had the best sleep in history. Before you start, turn off the light, snuggle up on your soft pillow, and let the modern world outside. If you like what you hear, give it a like and subscribe, but only if you want to. No pressure. In the comments, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. Now take a deep breath, relax, and let's travel. Sleep. That modern gift that many of us with our orthopedic mattresses and memory foam pillows still struggle to achieve. You with your Egyptian cotton pajamas and the soothing sound of a meditation app might imagine that in ages past, life was simpler, more connected to nature, and therefore sleep should be an uninterrupted wonder. Especially for the Vikings, isn't it? Those sturdy warriors, fearless navigators with their imposing beards and sharp axes. The image that comes to mind is of exhausted men and women after a day of plundering or farming, falling into a deep and restful sleep, without worries, without the anxiety of unanswered email or the bill to pay. A kind of Nordic nirvana, where snoring was the only nocturnal symphony. But my dear listener, allow me to demystify this romantic fantasy. The idea that the Vikings enjoyed the best sleep in history is as accurate as the notion that they wore horned helmets. It is a modern construction, a fairy tale for adults who yearn for a simplicity that never existed. Think about it. Do you really believe that a society that lived on the brink of hunger, disease, and constant violence could afford peaceful, uninterrupted sleep? The reality was much more grainy, and frankly, much less comfortable. Forget the image of the warrior asleep under a starry sky, lulled by the gentle rocking of a ship. Viking life was a succession of challenges, battles against the elements, against enemies, and often against one's own body. Sleep was not a refuge, but a precarious need, constantly threatened. There was no sleep hygiene in the Viking Age unless you consider not dying during the night, a form of hygiene. The darkness brought not only rest but also hidden dangers, ancestral fears, and constant vigilance. Imagine yourself in their shoes. No electric light to ward off the shadows, no central heating to combat the biting cold, no medicine to relieve chronic pain. The world was a noisy, smelly, and often brutal place. Every noise in the night could be a predator, an invader, or just the wind howling through the cracks of a poorly built house. Sleep, for the Vikings, was a temporary respite, a brief interlude between one day of toil and another, always with one eye half open to imminent danger. So before you sigh with envy for the supposed Viking sleep, get ready for a dose of reality. Because the truth is, if you were a Viking, you'd probably be more concerned about not getting eaten by a wolf or stabbed by a neighbor than you were about counting sheep. Now imagine yourself coming home after a long day of, well, whatever the Vikings did. Maybe you spent hours plowing a field with a rudimentary plow, or maybe you came back from a raid with the smell of salt and blood still pervading your woolen clothes. You long for a place to rest, to warm up, and then you enter your home. Don't think of a modern house with smooth walls, glass windows, and a ventilation system. Forget the concept of fresh air. The Viking house, the famous longhouse, was at best a smokebox, usually constructed of wood, peat, or stone with a thatched roof. These structures were designed to retain heat, which was essential in the brutal Nordic winters. The problem is that the main source of heat and light was an open fire, right in the center of the house. Yes, you heard it right. A bonfire, indoors. And the smoke? The smoke. She had nowhere to go but upwards, where she would pile up under the roof before slowly escaping through a small opening in the ridge or, more often, through any crack or hole she could find. So instead of a cozy home, you entered a dense environment, with the heavy, spicy air of wood smoke, mixed with the smells of sweat, animals, cooking food, and frankly, everything else that a community living in constant proximity could produce. His eyes burned, his throat itched. Visibility was limited, and every breath was a constant reminder of air quality. There were no chimneys as we know them today, just a hole in the roof that was more of a suggestion than an effective solution for ventilation. Think about the impact of this on your sleep. You'd lie down, and the smoke would continue to rise, enveloping you in an annoying mist. His lungs worked harder, his body tried to adapt. It wasn't just the smell, it was the constant irritation in the airways, the occasional cough, the feeling of suffocation that prevented a deep and restful sleep. And it wasn't just the smoke from the campfire. Imagine the smell of dried fish hanging to heal, the pungent odor of freshly skinned animal skins, the unmistakable aroma of cattle and sheep droppings that often shared the same roof, or at least the same adjacent space. If you have allergies today or are bothered by air pollution, life in a Viking longhouse would be your worst nightmare. There were no air purifiers, no windows to open, and air, the environment. Smoke was a constant and intrinsic part of daily and nighttime life. And as you tried to fall asleep, the smell of smoke permeated your clothes, your hair, your skin. You would wake up with it, live with it, and probably die with it. So the next time you complain about the smell of burning food in your kitchen, remember the Viking longhouse, and thank for your chimney. You managed to survive the smoke and odors of the longhouse. Congratulations. Now it's time to lie down. But don't expect a pocket spring mattress or a Japanese futon. Forget latex, memory foam, and even good old corn husks. Viking beds were at best raised wooden platforms, often along the walls of the house, covered with whatever was available. And what was available? Mainly straw, hay, or moss. And on top of that, animal skins. Imagine the scene. You, exhausted, crawl into your bed. The straw, which should offer some cushioning, was rough, pricked, and over time, compacted, becoming as hard as the dirt floor. There wasn't the softness we associate with good rest. And the skins? The skins. They were his cover, and in theory, his isolation. Sheepskins, bearskins, deerskins, whatever had been hunted or raised. They were heavy, often rancid and rarely washed. Washing a skin was a complex and time-consuming process, and the priority was functionality, not hygiene. And here we enter the realm of small nocturnal horrors. The straw, hay, and skins were a haven for a myriad of unwanted creatures. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, mites, a microscopic and not-so-microscopic fauna that made his bed his home. Think of the constant itching, the feeling of something crawling over your skin as you desperately try to fall asleep. There were no insecticides, no repellents, not even the simple idea of changing the straw regularly to avoid infestations. With every movement, you probably stirred up a cloud of parasites ready for the next meal. Personal hygiene was a very different concept in the Viking Age. Bathing was rare and often limited to rudimentary saunas or baths in icy rivers. Bedding, as we know it, simply did not exist. The skins and straw were used for long periods, accumulating sweat, dirt, food scraps, and of course the waste of the parasites. The smell of unwashed bodies, dirty skins, and moldy straw must have been a constant, a perfume that permeated the environment and impregnated everything. You, with your 400 thread count sheet and your allergy-free pillow, can afford to turn and turn until you find the perfect position. To a Viking, every movement in bed was a reminder of discomfort. The straw shifted, the skins curled, and the itch was a constant symphony. There was no promise of uninterrupted and restful sleep. It was more a matter of exhaustion overcoming the discomfort, forcing the body into a state of semi-unconsciousness, where dreams were probably interrupted by a sting here, an itch there. So the next time you lie down in your soft, clean bed and still have trouble sleeping, remember the Vikings. They didn't have the option of a new mattress or a hot shower before bed. They would lie down in a nest of straw and fur, sharing their space with a community of hungry insects. And each morning, they would wake up with the feeling that they had fought a battle during the night. And in a way, they did. You've already settled on your straw bed, feeling the rough edges sticking and the rancid smell of the furs. But the Viking night wasn't just about the discomfort of the bed. It was about the life that was teeming around him, a life that didn't ask permission to exist. The longhouse wasn't just a shelter for humans. It was a vibrant ecosystem, a 5-star hotel for everything that crawled, flew, or gnawed. And these unwanted companions were masters at disturbing the deepest sleep. Think of rats and mice. They were a constant presence, attracted by the scraps of food, the stored grain, and the warmth of the central fire. As you tried to fall asleep, you could hear the clawing of your tiny little paws against the peat walls, the occasional squeal of a fight over a forgotten piece of bread, or the unmistakable sound of something being gnawed in the darkness. It wasn't a relaxing sound, like the singing of a cricket on a summer night. It was the sound of the infestation, of the invasion of his most intimate space. And of course, there was a risk that one of these rodents, in its incessant search for food, would decide to exploit its bed or worse, its sleeping face. A little scare in the middle of the night, guaranteed to awaken even the most exhausted of Vikings. But the rodents were just the beginning. The air, already heavy with smoke, was also an aerial corridor for flies and mosquitoes. In the summer, the flies buzzed incessantly, landing on everything, including you. In the winter, maybe fewer flies, but mosquitoes, if there were any puddles of standing water nearby, could still be a pest. And there were no screens on the windows, no outlet repellents. The only defense was an occasional slap or resignation. And then, we have the smaller but no less annoying parasites. We have already talked about the fleas and lice that infested the straw beds and the skins. But they were not limited to the bed. They were in your clothes, in your hair, in your pets, if you were lucky enough to have a dog or cat. That was also hosts. The itching was a constant, an irritation that became more intense in the stillness of the night, when there were no distractions to divert his attention. Imagine trying to sleep while your entire body itches, and you know that the source of the itch is literally living in you. Also, we can't forget the larger animals that often shared the same roof. In many longhouses, a portion of the structure was dedicated to cattle during the colder months. The smell, of course, was a problem, but so was the noise. The moo of a cow, the bleating of a sheep, the grunt of a pig. All these could burst into the middle of the night, breaking any attempt at deep sleep. And of course, where there are animals, there is their waste, which attracted even more insects and rodents. So as you snuggle up in your quiet room protected by solid walls and sealed windows, remember the nocturnal symphony of a Viking longhouse, the scratching of mice, the buzzing of flies, the incessant itching of fleas, and the occasional rattling of an animal. It was not an environment conducive to restful sleep. It was a constant battle against nature, even indoors. And the victory, many times, was just exhaustion. You're already lying down, the smoke irritating your lungs, the parasites dancing on your skin, and the rodents having a private party in the corner of the house. But there's another crucial factor that kept Viking sleep from being anything remotely like the best in history: diet. Or more accurately, the lack of a regular, balanced, and frankly, easy-to-digest diet. Forget your pre-made meals, your fiber supplements, and your digestive teas. For a Viking, every meal was a gamble, and the result could be a night of gastric torment. Viking food was dictated by the season: hunting, fishing, and rudimentary agriculture. There were no supermarkets, no refrigerators. Food was often preserved by salting, smoking, or drying, processes that altered texture and sometimes digestibility. Think salted and dried meat, smoked fish, hard, dense rye bread, and porridge made from coarse grains. Fresh vegetables were a rarity, and fruit was a seasonal delicacy. The basis of the diet was often composed of foods rich in indigestible fiber and heavy proteins. Imagine eating a plate of skyr, a type of thick yogurt, with dried fish and rye bread for dinner, or maybe a game meat stew with root vegetables, cooked for hours in a pot over the fire. The problem was not the lack of calories, but the quality and consistency. The food was often heavy, fibrous, and for a modern stomach, quite a challenge. There was not the lightness of a salad or the ease of digestion of white rice. It was all dense, rustic, and sometimes a little rancid. And regularity? Forget 3 meals a day. The Vikings ate when they could, which meant they could go long periods without food, followed by feasts where they gorged themselves to compensate. This cycle of hunger and plenty was a constant shock to the digestive system. An empty stomach can rumble and keep you awake, but an overworked stomach, struggling to process a heavy, fibrous meal, is a recipe for nighttime discomfort. Heartburn, bloating, gas, cramping. These were all likely nighttime companions for the average Viking. There were no antacids, no probiotics, no simple wisdom to eat light before bed. You ate what you had, when you had it, and dealt with the consequences. Digestion was a slow and often painful process, especially when the body was lying down. The noises of his own stomach, the aches and pains and the discomfort, could be as disturbing as the rats on the wall. And let's not forget water. There was no filtered or bottled water. The water came from wells, rivers, or streams, and its purity was questionable. Drinking contaminated water could lead to diarrhea and other gastrointestinal diseases, which, let's face it, aren't exactly sleep-inducing. Imagine having to get up in the middle of the night in a dark, cold longhouse to deal with a bowel emergency. It's not exactly the scene of a sleep of the gods. So the next time you're pondering what to eat before bed, and maybe opt for something bland to avoid indigestion, remember the Vikings. They didn't have that option. They ate to survive, and the price was often a night of fighting their own digestive system. Sleep to them was a battle fought on several fronts, and the stomach was just another battlefield. You're already lying down, your stomach protesting the last meal, the smoke irritating your eyes and the parasites partying. But there is another element that made Viking sleep a chimera: the body. Not the athletic and idealized body of the movies, but the real, exhausted, sore, and often injured body of an average Viking. Forget the idea of an 8-hour workday with coffee breaks and ergonomic chairs. Viking life was a marathon of brutal physical exertion, from dawn to dusk. Imagine a Viking's day. If you were a farmer, you spent hours hunched over the land, plowing, sowing, harvesting, all by hand. If he was a fisherman, he fought against the waves and the wind, pulling heavy nets. If he was a warrior, he trained with weapons, marched for miles, and, on days of battle, faced a physical and mental strain that few of us can even conceive. There were no machines, no elevators, no cars. Every task, from fetching water to building a house, required brute strength and endurance. The result? Bodies constantly exhausted. Sore muscles, creaking joints, back bent by repetitive effort. There was no physical therapy, no over-the-counter painkillers, no relaxing massages. A back pain was a back pain, and you simply had to live with it. A sprained ankle meant limping for weeks, maybe months. Poorly healed fractures, scars from old wounds, early arthritis. All of these were part of a Viking's body landscape. And those chronic pains didn't magically disappear when the head touched the straw. On the contrary, in the stillness of the night, without the distractions of the day, the pains could become even more prominent. Imagine trying to find a comfortable sleeping position when your shoulders ache from carrying wood, your knees protest from walking, and an old battle scar throbs with the changing weather. Deep, restful sleep is nearly impossible when your body is constantly sending out warning signals. In addition to the physical pain, there was exhaustion, an exhaustion that went beyond the fatigue of a day's work. It was an accumulated exhaustion which seeped into the bones, into the mind. But paradoxically, this exhaustion did not guarantee an easy sleep. The mind, even exhausted, remained attentive. The body might have been begging for rest, but the mind was in survival mode. Think of constant vigilance. Even at home, there was a need to be alert to dangers. And if you were on an expedition, vigilance was even more crucial. Sleep was a luxury that could be interrupted at any moment by an enemy attack, a wild animal, or a simple suspicious noise. This mental tension, this need to always be ready to react, prevented the mind from completely relaxing. So as you stretch out on your soft bed, perhaps after a mentally exhausting but physically light day at work, remember the Vikings. They didn't have the luxury of a pain-free body or a worry-free mind. Sleep, for them, was a struggle against physical pain and mental strain, an attempt to find brief relief in the midst of a life of incessant effort. It was not the best sleep in history. It was the sleep of survival. You're exhausted, sore, and your stomach is still grumbling. But there's an even more insidious enemy of Viking sleep than fleas or smoke: fear. Not the abstract fear of a bill to pay, but the visceral and constant fear of invasion. The Viking Age was not a picnic in the park. It was a period of instability, of pillage, of rival clans and kingdoms in the making. Peace was the exception, not the rule. Imagine living in a community where at any moment, a group of warriors from a neighboring village, or worse, from a distant land, could appear on the horizon. There were no police, no regular army to protect you. Defense was the responsibility of the community itself, and often the only form of defense was constant surveillance. This looming threat seeped into every aspect of life, and sleep was no exception. It wasn't just an occasional nightmare. It was a deep anxiety, a state of alertness that never completely shut down. Even when you were exhausted and your body begged for rest, your mind remained on guard. Every noise in the night, the howling of the wind, the crackling of a branch, the barking of a distant dog, could be interpreted as the sound of an enemy approaching. There were no security alarms, no surveillance cameras. The only way to know if you were safe was to trust your senses and the vigilance of others. Many communities had night guards, but even so, the responsibility of being attentive fell on everyone. You slept with one ear half open, ready for the wake-up call, for the cry of enemies, that could mean the difference between life and death, between freedom and slavery. Think about the psychological impact of this, the inability to completely relax, to surrender to deep and restful sleep. The body may be lying down, but the mind is running, simulating scenarios, assessing threats. This leads to fragmented sleep, full of micro-awakenings, where you never reach the deeper, more restorative phases of sleep. You wake up more tired than when you went to sleep with your nerves on edge. And it wasn't just the fear of outside invaders. There were also internal tensions in the community, disputes over land, power, and honor. Betrayal was a real possibility, and revenge was an accepted part of the culture. You slept in an environment where trust was a luxury, and distrust was a necessity. In contrast, you in your safe bed, perhaps with the door locked and an alarm system, can afford to feel safe. The greatest danger you face at night is perhaps a nightmare about work or worrying about the next day. For a Viking, the nightmare could come true at any moment. So the next time you feel a little anxious before bed, and maybe worry about a strange noise outside, remember the Vikings. They didn't have the luxury of security. They slept with the shadow of violence hanging over them, and fear was a constant companion, whispering in their ears and preventing them from finding true rest. Sleep, for them, was a precarious truce, always on the verge of being broken. You're already dealing with the smoke, the parasites, the pain, and the constant fear. Now, add to that the complete absence of privacy. Forget your single room, your door that locks, your personal space where you can retreat from the world. In the Viking Age, especially in longhouses, the concept of privacy was, to say the least, non-existent, and this had a direct and profound impact on sleep quality. Longhouses were large communal halls where entire families, and sometimes several families, lived, ate, worked, and slept under the same roof. There were no internal walls, nor clear divisions between spaces. The beds, as we have already mentioned, were platforms along the walls, and you slept side by side with your parents, your siblings, your children, your grandparents, and perhaps even with some aggregates or servants. Imagine the scene. Dozens of people, maybe even more, breathing, snoring, coughing, moving, talking in dreams, and performing all the bodily functions that a human being needs to perform. There were no internal toilets, nor the discretion of a flush. The toilets were done outdoors or in buckets that were emptied in the morning. The smell, the sight, the sound, everything was shared. The lack of personal space meant that you were constantly aware of the presence of others. His uncle's snoring, the crying of his neighbor's baby, his grandmother's gnashing of teeth. All of these contributed to a nocturnal symphony that was far from relaxing. There was no escaping the noise, the light, even if little, the central fire, or the movement of others. If someone got up to go to the bathroom, or to check the fire, or to attend to an animal, you would inevitably be disturbed. For us, privacy is an essential component of restful sleep. The ability to isolate oneself, to create a personal sanctuary where the mind can disconnect from social interactions and the outside world. For the Vikings, this option simply did not exist. You were always in public, even when you tried to sleep. This created a state of subliminal alertness where the mind never allowed itself to fully relax, always processing the surrounding stimuli. Marital intimacy, for example, was something that had to be accomplished with the awareness that there were other people just a few feet away, perhaps even listening. There was no luxury of a moment alone, which added a layer of stress and embarrassment that certainly did not contribute to a peaceful sleep. In addition, the constant proximity meant that any contagious disease spread quickly. A family member with a cough or fever meant that everyone was exposed, and the night became a symphony of coughs, sneezes, and moans. So the next time you close the door to your room or put on your headphones to block out the noise of the world, remember the Vikings. They didn't have that option. They slept in a human hive, where every sound, every movement, every smell was shared. Sleep, for them, was not a private retreat but a communal experience, constantly interrupted by the life that teemed around them. It was not the best sleep in history, it was the sleep of resignation. You've gotten used to the smoke, the parasites, the pains, the fear, and the complete lack of privacy. But there's another unwanted guest in the Viking bed that guaranteed nights of torment: illness. Forget your antibiotics, your painkillers, your cough syrups, and even simple aspirin. In the Viking Age, medicine was rudimentary, hygiene was an alien concept to most, and disease was a constant. a dark presence that manifested itself particularly cruelly in the stillness of the night. Imagine yourself lying on your already uncomfortable straw bed when a fever begins to rise. Your body shivers with cold, then burns with heat. Your throat scratches. Your muscles hurt. There is no thermometer to measure temperature, nor a doctor to diagnose it. The only cure available was perhaps an infusion of bitter herbs, or a prayer to the gods, or at worst a bloodletting done by someone with more goodwill than anatomical knowledge. The lack of basic sanitation was a fertile ground for all kinds of affliction. Contaminated drinking water, poorly preserved food, constant proximity to animals and their waste, and the absence of personal hygiene practices such as regular hand washing, all contributed to the proliferation of diseases. Dysentery, typhus, smallpox, tuberculosis, worms of all kinds were common companions, and these diseases did not respect bedtime. Think of a night of severe diarrhea. There is no private bathroom, nor soft toilet paper. You need to get up in the dark, stumbling over sleeping bodies, to get out of the longhouse and find a suitable spot, or use a bucket that will be emptied in the morning. With each back and forth, sleep is broken. The body is exhausted even more, and dignity, well, dignity was a luxury that few could afford. Or imagine a persistent cough which shakes your body every few minutes, preventing you from breathing deeply and finding any kind of rest. Or a stabbing toothache which throbs nonstop, without the hope of a painkiller to relieve it. The pain was a constant, and in the darkness of the night, without the distractions of the day, it became even more amplified, more unbearable. And it wasn't just acute illnesses. There were also chronic conditions: arthritis, rheumatism, skin infections, wounds that never healed completely. These afflictions caused constant discomfort, pains that intensified with the cold of the night or with the humidity. The body, already exhausted by daily work, was even more burdened by the fight against the disease. For us, a cold or a headache is inconvenient. For a Viking, it could be death sentences or at least weeks of excruciating suffering. And sleep, which should be the great restorer, was constantly sabotaged by a body at war with itself. There was no luxury of a night's uninterrupted sleep to recover. Each night was a battle, and often the disease won, leading the individual to a state of even greater exhaustion. So the next time you catch a cold and complain about a bad night's sleep, remember the Vikings. They didn't have the pharmacy on the corner, nor the emergency room. They faced their illnesses in darkness with little help and much pain. Sleep for them was not a balm, but more of a battlefield where the body fought its own inner demons. It was not the best sleep in history. It was the sleep of resignation and suffering. You are already immersed in the symphony of Viking nocturnal discomforts. The smoke, the parasites, the pains, the fear of invasion and diseases. But there is a torment that manifested itself not only in the body, but in the mind itself, invading the sanctuary of sleep, battle trauma, and nightmares. Forget about post-traumatic therapy, support groups, or anxiety medications. For a Viking warrior, the war did not end when the battle was over. It continued to be fought in the darkness of the night, in the recesses of the mind. The life of a Viking, especially for men, was often marked by violence. Battles, raids, pillaging, village defenses, exposure to death, mutilation, and brutality was a constant. It wasn't just the physical pain of an injury. It was the image of his companion falling beside him, the cry of the enemy, the smell of blood and viscera, the feeling of the axe cutting through the flesh. These experiences were not simply forgotten at the end of the day. They lodged in the mind, waiting for the stillness of the night to reappear. Imagine yourself lying down, exhausted, trying to find some sleep relief. But instead of rest, his mind transports him back to the battlefield. You relive the most terrible moments: the clang of metal, the screams of pain, the sight of dismembered bodies. Cold sweat runs down your forehead, your heart races, and you wake up panting, your body panicked, as if you're still there. It was not an isolated nightmare. It was a constant repetition, a nocturnal torture that prevented any restful sleep. The lack of understanding about mental health meant that these demons were perhaps seen as curses or as personal weaknesses. There was no vocabulary to describe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, but its symptoms were intensely experienced. Insomnia, irritability, hypervigilance, flashbacks, all contributed to a vicious cycle of disrupted sleep and increasing anxiety. And it wasn't just the direct trauma of the battle. There was also guilt, grief for lost comrades, the questionable morality of some actions. The mind, without the distractions of the day, became a stage for these disturbing thoughts. There was no way to turn off the brain, nor the possibility of seeking professional help to process these experiences. For us, a nightmare is usually an isolated event, an anomaly. For a Viking, especially a warrior, it could be a regular part of the nightly experience. And the impact of this on daily life was immense. Chronic sleep deprivation, combined with psychological stress, led to fatigue, difficulty concentrating, irritability, and a general state of mental exhaustion. There was no way to truly recover, for the night, instead of being a refuge, was more of a battlefield. Think of the irony. The same warrior who was feared by his enemies, who faced death without blinking, was vulnerable in his own bed, attacked by his own inner demons. Sleep, which should be the great healer, became a source of more suffering. So the next time you have a nightmare and wake up scared but soon go back to sleep in your safe room, remember the Vikings. They didn't have the luxury of forgetting. Their battles continued in darkness, and sleep for them was often an extension of the battlefield, where the mind was the last enemy to be faced. It was not the best sleep in history. It was the sleep of torment. You're already trying to dodge the ghosts of battle and body aches, but there's a constant symphony that permeated the Viking longhouse, an orchestra of noises that ensured that deep sleep was a rare privilege. The crying of children and cattle. Forget the silence of your modern home, where the only sound is the hum of the refrigerator or the snoring of your partner. In the Viking Age, life was an uninterrupted cacophony, and the night brought no respite. Think about babies. Yes, they existed in the Viking Age, and like all babies, they cried. They cried of hunger, cold, pain, dirty diapers, and at the longhouse, where dozens of people slept side by side, a baby's crying was not an isolated problem for parents. It was a problem for everyone. There were no soundproof nurseries, no baby monitors to monitor from a distance. The cry echoed through the peat walls, penetrating the deepest dreams and dragging everyone back to the noisy reality. And when one baby cried, it was common for others to wake up, creating a domino effect of childish wailing. And it wasn't just the babies. Older children, even when asleep, could be sources of noise. A nightmare, a bedwetting, a sudden movement that knocked something over. All of this contributed to the interruption of sleep. There were no separate rooms for the children, nor the possibility of sending them to bed on a different floor. They were there, by his side, breathing, dreaming, and occasionally screaming. But the night orchestra was not limited to humans. Remember that in many longhouses, especially during the colder months, the animals shared the same roof, or at least an adjacent space, separated by a rudimentary partition. The cattle, the sheep, the pigs, the chickens, they all had their own needs and their own noises. Imagine the mooing of a cow in the middle of the night, perhaps thirsty or uncomfortable, the insistent bleating of a sheep, the grunt and sniff of a pig, the occasional cluck of a chicken that dreamed of a worm. And it was not only the sounds of the animals themselves, but also the sounds of their movements, the dragging of hooves on the straw, the pounding of horns, the incessant chewing. To us, these sounds can be picturesque on a distant farm. To a Viking, it was the sounds of their home, and they wouldn't be silent when the sun went down. The combination of the child's crying and the noises of the animals created an environment of constant disturbance. There was no escape. If you could fall asleep amid the smoke and parasites, you would be awakened by the wail of a baby or the mooing of a cow. Sleep was fragmented, interrupted, and never reached the depth necessary for a true restoration. For us, silence is often a prerequisite for good sleep. We use ear protectors, soundproof windows, and even white noise machines to drown out the sounds of the outside world. For a Viking, the white noise was life itself, a symphony of survival that never ceased. So the next time you complain about the noise of the neighbors or the crying of the baby next door, remember the Vikings. They slept in a human and animal barn where silence was an unknown luxury. Sleep, for them, was not a peaceful refuge, but an attempt to rest in the midst of an incessant cacophony. It was not the best sleep in history. It was the sleep of resignation to noise. You're already trying to ignore the baby's cry and the cow's mooing, but there's another factor that shaped Viking sleep in a way that you, with your bedside lamp and smartphone, can barely conceive. Total darkness and dependence on natural rhythms. Forget about the light pollution of cities, the street lights that filter through your window, or the bluish glow of your tablet screen. For a Viking, when the sun went down, darkness was almost absolute, and this had its own implications for sleep. In the Viking Age, the main source of light after sunset was the central fire in the longhouse, or perhaps some torches and animal oil lamps. But even these sources were limited and did not illuminate the environment uniformly. Most of the house remained in deep shadows, and outside of it, darkness was complete unless there was a full moon or the lights of the aurora borealis. There was no electric light to extend the day artificially, to allow you to read a book late or watch a movie. This meant that life was dictated by the solar cycle. The activities began with sunrise and ended with sunset. There was no option to stay up all night working or having fun. The human body at its core is programmed to follow these circadian rhythms, and the Vikings lived in perfect sync with them. In theory, this should lead to more natural and restful sleep, right? The body grew weary with the sun and slept with the darkness, but the reality was more complex. Total darkness, although natural, also brought with it a series of fears and discomforts. Without light, the dangers multiplied. The risk of tripping, encountering a wild animal, or being surprised by an enemy was much greater. The human mind, even today, tends to fill the void of darkness with fantasies and fears. For a Viking, who lived in a world where the dangers were very real, the darkness was a constant reminder of his vulnerability. In addition, the absence of artificial light meant that winter nights, especially in the northern latitudes, were incredibly long. Hours and hours of darkness with few distractions. This could lead to a deep boredom, to a state of lethargy that paradoxically did not necessarily translate into quality sleep. The body could be tired, but the mind, without stimuli, could become a breeding ground for rumination and anxiety. And fire, the only source of light and heat, had its own problems. The intermittent glow of flames, dancing shadows on the walls, excessive heat in some places and cold in others, all these could disturb sleep. It was not a soft, steady light, but a source of visual and thermal stimulation that prevented complete relaxation. For us, the ability to control light is a luxury. We can turn on a light to go to the bathroom, or use a flashlight to find something in the dark. We can adjust the intensity of the light to create a relaxing environment. To a Viking, darkness was a force of nature, and they were at his mercy. So the next time you complain about the streetlight coming in through your window, or the glow of your digital alarm clock, remember the Vikings. They lived in a world where darkness was the rule and light was the exception. Sleep, for them, was an immersion in the night with all its mysteries and dangers. It was not the best sleep in history. It was sleep dictated by nature, with all its impositions. You're already trying to adjust to the near-total darkness. But the Viking night wasn't just visually challenging. It was a symphony of sounds, a constant soundtrack that prevented any pretense of silence and, consequently, of deep sleep. Forget about soundproofing in your modern home, where the biggest noise is the hum of your refrigerator or distant traffic. For a Viking, the night was a stage for the elements and wildlife, and every sound could be a reminder of their vulnerability. Think of the wind. Not the gentle wind that sways the curtains, but the howling wind from the Nordic lands, which seeped through the cracks in the peat and wood walls of the longhouse. He hissed, moaned, and sometimes roared like a beast, shaking the structure and causing each plank to creak in protest. That constant sound, that invisible pressure against your shelter, was a reminder that you were at the mercy of nature, and there was no turning it off. The wind brought with it the cold, and the cold in turn brought more discomfort. And the rain, not the gentle rain that gently hits the window, but the torrential rain that fell on the thatched roof, creating an incessant pattering. Drops that turned into streams, trickling down the walls, and inevitably finding their way into the house. The sound of water dripping into a bucket or the smell of wet earth and mold were constant companions. And if the rain was accompanied by a storm with thunderous thunder and lightning briefly illuminating the interior of the longhouse, sleep was a lost cause. But it wasn't just the elements. There were the sounds of wildlife, the distant howl of a wolf, a sound that for a Viking was not romantic but a warning of danger, the croaking of frogs in a nearby swamp, the hoot of an owl hunting, the rustling of leaves that could be an animal or worse, an invader. Each sound was amplified in the stillness of the night, and the mind, already in a state of alertness, tried to decipher its origin and its meaning. Inside the longhouse, the symphony continued. In addition to the cries of children and the noises of animals we have already mentioned, There was the constant crackling of fire, the crackling of wood, the whisper of muffled conversation, the creaking of planks under the weight of someone turning around, and of course the snoring of dozens of people sleeping nearby, creating a chorus of respiratory noises that mixed with external sounds. For us, silence is a luxury we actively seek to sleep. We use ear protectors, white noise machines, or simply rely on the solidity of our walls to isolate us from the world. To a Viking, silence was an anomaly, a sign that something was wrong. Life was noisy, and the night was no different. Imagine trying to reach REM sleep, that deep and restorative stage, while the wind howls like a ghost, the rain drums like an army, and the wolf howls its hunting song. The body may be exhausted, but the mind is constantly processing these stimuli, preventing you from completely surrendering to rest. Sleep was shallow, fragmented, and always on the verge of being broken by yet another unexpected sound. So the next time you lie down in your quiet room, and maybe get annoyed by the sound of a car passing by on the street, remember the Vikings. They slept amid a natural animal-like orchestra, where every note was a reminder of the harshness of life. Sleep for them was not a silent refuge, but an attempt to rest in the midst of an incessant cacophony. It was not the best sleep in history, it was the sleep of noise. You're already enveloped in the symphony of nocturnal noises, but there's one element that, more than any other, turned Viking sleep into an epic ordeal. Winter. Not the winter you know, with central heating, electric blankets and hot chocolate. The Nordic winter was a relentless beast, a season of almost perpetual darkness and cold that penetrated to the bone, and its claws extended deep over sleep. Imagine living in latitudes where the sun barely rises above the horizon for weeks at a time. The nights weren't just long, were infinite. Dusk merged with dawn, and darkness dominated. To a Viking, this meant hours and hours of enforced inactivity, confined to the smoky, noisy longhouse. The lack of natural light affected the circadian rhythm, making it difficult for the body to distinguish between day and night and consequently regulate sleep. And the cold. The cold. Even inside the longhouse with the central fire pit, the heat was not evenly distributed. The areas farthest from the fire were icy, and the cold air seeped through every crack. You slept in layers of woolen clothing, covered in animal skins, but the cold still found its way. Think of the feeling of having cold feet and hands even under the covers, preventing you from completely relaxing. The body was constantly struggling to maintain temperature, an effort that robbed energy and prevented deep sleep. Waking up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, i.e., going out into the biting cold, was torture. The idea of getting out of the relative warmth of the skins to face the cold air was enough to make anyone postpone the need until the last minute, which, of course, did not contribute to a peaceful sleep. And if you had to get up to feed the cattle or to check something outside, the thermal shock was brutal. Humidity was also an issue. Cold, moist air condensed on the interior surfaces of the longhouse, creating a damp and musty environment. The straw of the bed became damp, the skins became heavy and cold. There were no dehumidifiers, no dryers. The feeling of constant dampness and cold was a discomfort that seeped into every pore, making sleep a damp and cold experience. In addition to the physical discomfort, winter brought with it a psychological burden. Prolonged darkness and isolation could lead to melancholy, seasonal depression. The mind, without the light and activity of summer, could become a breeding ground for dark thoughts and anxiety. And an anxious mind, as we know, is an enemy of sleep. For us, winter is a season of coziness, of fireplaces and warm blankets. For a Viking, it was a survival station, where each night was a battle against cold and darkness. Sleep was not a refuge, but a precarious need, constantly threatened by the elements. So the next time you snuggle up in your heated bed with the thermostat set to a pleasant temperature, and maybe complain about the cold outside, remember the Vikings. They faced nights that seemed to have no end, in a cold that froze the soul. Sleep, for them, was not the best in history. It was the sleep of resistance, a constant struggle against ruthless nature. You're already shivering with cold even under the skins, and the darkness of winter seems endless. But there's an even more challenging setting for Viking sleep than the smoky, icy longhouse: the open sea. Forget your luxury cruise with private cabins, comfortable beds, and the soft rocking of the ship lulling you to sleep. For a Viking, sleeping on a nar or longship was a brutal experience, a constant battle against the elements and the vessel itself. Imagine yourself aboard a Viking ship. There were no enclosed cabins, no padded bunks. The deck was his room, and the sky was his ceiling. You slept in the open air, exposed to the vagaries of the weather. The wind whipped your face, the rain and waves threw salt water over you, and the cold of the ocean seeped into your woolen garments, making them heavy and damp. There was no way to dry himself completely, nor to really warm himself. The bed was the wooden deck itself, hard and unforgiving. Maybe you had an animal skin to lie on, but it would quickly get wet and cold. The constant rocking of the ship, which for some may be relaxing, for others was a source of seasickness and disorientation. And it was not a smooth swing. It was the violent hurling of a small, open vessel against the relentless waves of the North Atlantic. Every wave that crashed on the hull, every screech of the wood, every crack of the mast, was a reminder of its precarious existence. Think about the noise. The howling of the wind in the sails, the cracking of the ropes, the sound of the water crashing against the hull, the creaking of the wood, the screams of sailors in the midst of a storm. There was no silence, nor the promise of a quiet night. Sleep was constantly interrupted by these sounds, by the need to adjust the sails to pump the water that entered the ship, or to simply hold on from being thrown out. What about security? Zero. You slept with one eye open, aware of the dangers of the sea. Sudden storms, icebergs, enemy ships, or simply the possibility of falling overboard in the darkness and being swallowed by the icy waves. Hypervigilance, which was already a constant on land, was amplified at sea. There was not the feeling of security that a port offers. Each night was a bet against nature and fate. Hygiene was practically non-existent. Fresh water was a precious resource, used for drinking, not washing. The smell of salt, sweat, fish, and vomit permeated the air and clothes. You slept in your own dirty, wet clothes and woke up with the same feeling of discomfort. For us, a ship trip is synonymous with vacation, with relaxation. For a Viking, it was a journey of deprivation and danger, where sleep was a luxury that could rarely be enjoyed. Physical and mental exhaustion was constant, but restful sleep was almost impossible to achieve. You slept in fragments, in short, shallow naps, always ready for the next emergency. So the next time you lie down in your soft, warm bed, and maybe dream of a cruise trip, remember the Vikings. They did not have cabins overlooking the sea, but rather the sea itself as a roof. They didn't have the luxury of a peaceful sleep, but rather the constant battle against the elements. Sleep for them was not the best in history. It was the sleep of survival, a precarious respite from the fury of the ocean. You've survived the relentless rocking of the ship and the fury of the ocean, but even on dry land, the life of a Viking, especially that of an expedition warrior, offered no respite from sleep. Forget the idea of a safe camp with well-placed sentries and a peaceful sleep. For a Viking warrior, vigilance was a constant companion, a shadow that refused to fade even when the eyes closed. Imagine yourself in enemy territory or in an unknown land after a day of exhausting marching or plundering. Your body cries out for rest, your muscles hurt, your mind is overloaded. You lie down, perhaps under a tree, perhaps in a makeshift tent, with your weapon within reach. But sleep doesn't come easily. He can't come. The need to keep guard was paramount. There was no confidence in a robust security system. Security depended on his own ability to perceive, and the vigilance of his companions. Every noise in the forest, every rustle of leaves, every moving shadow was a potential enemy. His brain, even in a state of exhaustion, remained on high alert, processing every stimulus, assessing every threat. This means that sleep was shallow, fragmented. You didn't allow yourself to fall into a deep, restful sleep, one that truly restores your body and mind. Instead, you slept in short naps with an ever-attentive ear, ready to awaken at the slightest sign of danger. It was a sleep of survival, not rest. The body might be lying down, but the mind was on constant patrol. Think about the psychological impact of this chronic hypervigilance, the inability to relax completely, to surrender to unconsciousness, the constant anxiety that at any moment an attack could occur. This led to a state of permanent mental fatigue, where the line between sleep and wakefulness became blurred. You woke up more tired than when you went to sleep, with your nerves on edge, ready for the next threat. There was no luxury of a night's uninterrupted sleep to recover from the stress of battle or marching. Rather, the night was just another extension of the battlefield, where the mind fought against its own demons and the invisible threat of the enemy. The body might be exhausted, but the mind refused to shut down, to surrender to the vulnerability of deep sleep. And it wasn't just the fear of an external attack. There was also the need to watch one's own comrades, to ensure that no one deserted or betrayed the group. Trust was a luxury, and distrust was a survival tool. This internal tension added another layer of stress to the already precarious sleep situation. For us, safety is often a given. We sleep in houses with locked doors, alarms, and the certainty that the police are a call away. We can afford to switch off completely, to sink into a deep, worry-free sleep. For a Viking warrior, this was an unattainable fantasy. So the next time you lie down in your safe bed, and maybe worry about the noise of the wind outside, remember the Viking warriors. They slept with their sword at their sides, their ears attentive and their minds in a constant state of alert. Sleep for them was not the best in history. It was the sleep of vigilance, a precarious truce in the midst of a hostile world. You are already exhausted, sore, anxious, and with your body on constant alert. But there is one sense that, more than any other, ensured that Viking sleep was an unforgettable olfactory experience, and not in a good way. The smells of survival. Forget the lavender smell on your pillow, the scent of fabric softener on your bedding, or the fresh air coming in through your window. To a Viking, air was a complex and poignant mixture of all that raw life could offer. Imagine yourself lying on your bed of straw, and the first smell that hits you is that of wood smoke, constant and penetrating, impregnating every fiber of your clothes and your hair. But that was just the beginning. Add to that the smell of unwashed bodies. Showers were rare, and the idea of deodorant was as alien as that of a space rocket. The sweat, the dirt accumulated from days of intense physical labor, the smell of animal skins used as clothing and blankets, all of this blended into a human bouquet that was anything but pleasant. And it wasn't just humans. Remember that animals often shared the same space or were in close proximity. The smell of cattle, sheep, and pigs, their excrement, their urine, the smell of their bodies, was a constant. There were no sewage systems, no garbage collection. Organic waste was discarded nearby, contributing to an olfactory atmosphere that would make any of us run to the nearest air purifier. Think about the food. There were no refrigerators, so food was preserved by salting, smoking, or fermentation. The smell of dried and salted fish, smoked meat, rancid cheeses, fermented porridges. These aromas, although essential for survival, were not exactly inviting for a peaceful sleep. The smell of fish, in particular, could be overwhelming, permeating the environment and clothing. And there were the smells of daily activities. The smell of leather being tanned, of wool being processed, of wood being worked. The smell of ash and soot from the campfire. The smell of damp earth and mold, especially in the long, wet winters. Every aspect of Viking life contributed to this olfactory tapestry, and there was no escaping it. For us, a strong smell can be a temporary nuisance. We open a window, light a scented candle, or use a spray. To a Viking, these odors were the very essence of life, an inseparable part of his existence. They did not have the option to air the environment, nor to mask the smells. They slept immersed in this symphony of aromas, and the impact on sleep was undeniable. Strong odors can be stimulating, preventing relaxation. They can cause nausea, headaches, or simply persistent discomfort that prevents the body from indulging in deep sleep. The mind, even exhausted, was constantly processing these olfactory stimuli, preventing it from completely shutting down. So the next time you lie down in your clean, fragrant bed and maybe complain about a strange smell coming from the street, remember the Vikings. They slept in an environment where the air was a dense soup of smoke, sweat, excrement, fish, and mold. Sleep for them was not the best in history. It was the sleep of smell, a sensory experience that ensured that rest was never truly pure. You are already immersed in the raw reality of Viking sleep, a tapestry of smoke, parasites, aches, fears, and odors. Now, to really appreciate the gulf between their sleep and yours, let's do a contrast exercise. Think of all the little things you have today that, without realizing it, contribute to your sleep. And then, imagine life without them. For a Viking, the absence of modern comforts was not an inconvenience. It was the norm, and that norm made sleep a constant battle. Let's start with the basics. The bed. You have a mattress with springs. memory foam, maybe even a firmness adjustment system. The Viking had straw and furs. You have cotton sheets, soft blankets, fluffy comforters. The Viking had animal skins, often dirty and infested. You have ergonomic pillows. The Viking had a piece of wood or a bundle of clothing. The simple physical basis of rest was incomparably inferior. And the environment? You control the temperature of your room with a thermostat, ensuring that it is neither too hot nor too cold. The Viking was at the mercy of central fire, which created zones of heat and cold, and the drafts that seeped through the walls. You have windows that close tightly, isolating sound and light. The Viking had openings that let in the wind, rain, and noises of the night. You have blackout curtains to block the streetlight. The Viking had total darkness or the intermittent glow of fire. Think about hygiene. You take a hot shower before bed, brush your teeth, put on clean pajamas. The Viking, if he was lucky, would take the occasional bath in an icy river or a rudimentary sauna. The nightwear was the same as the clothes of the day, impregnated with sweat, smoke, and dirt. There was not the feeling of cleanliness and freshness that precedes a good sleep. And what about health? You have access to painkillers for a headache, antacids for indigestion, and doctors to treat ailments. The Viking dealt with chronic pain, digestive problems, and illness without any effective relief. A toothache could mean nights of agony. A fever, delirium, and cold sweats. There was no promise that the pain would be relieved, or that the disease would be cured. Security. You lock your door, turn on your alarm, and feel relatively safe in your home. The Viking slept with the constant threat of invasion, wild animals, fires. The mind could never relax completely, always in a state of alertness. Even the routine. You can choose when to go to bed, when to wake up, and have the freedom of a nap on the weekend. The Viking was dictated by the sun, by agricultural tasks, by the need for vigilance. Sleep was a luxury that could rarely be planned or enjoyed without interruption. In short, every little comfort you have today, from the softness of your pillow to the safety of your locked door, is an invisible pillar that supports the quality of your sleep. To a Viking, these pillars simply did not exist. They slept in a world where survival was the priority and comfort was a chimera. There was not the infrastructure, knowledge, or resources to create an environment conducive to restful sleep. So the next time you lie down in your soft bed, in your warm, quiet room, and still have trouble sleeping, remember the Vikings. They had none of that, and yet they persisted. Sleep for them was not the best in history. It was the sleep of deprivation, a daily test of resilience in a world that refused to offer any respite. You are already dealing with the smoke, the parasites, the aches, the fear of invasion, the odors, and the absence of any modern comforts. But there is another element that seeped into the Viking mind, especially in the stillness of the night, and that ensured that sleep was never truly worry-free. Superstitions and nocturnal spirits. Forget your nightmares about tight deadlines or the electricity bill. To a Viking, darkness brought with it a gallery of supernatural beings, ready to torment the living. The Viking Age was a world where the line between the natural and the supernatural was blurred, almost non-existent. The world was inhabited by gods, giants, elves, dwarves, and a myriad of lesser spirits, not all of them benevolent. Every forest, every mountain, every river had its own guardians or its own dangers. And the night, with its darkness and mystery, was the time when these entities became more active, more present. Imagine yourself lying on your straw bed, listening to the wind howl outside. It wasn't just the wind. It could be the wail of a draugr, an undead who refused to remain in his grave, or the whisper of a huldufolk, the hidden people, who could steal his cattle or even his children. Every dancing shadow on the wall, every crack of the wood could be interpreted as the presence of something that was not of this world. There was no scientific rationality to explain natural phenomena. A particularly vivid nightmare could be interpreted as a visit from an evil spirit. Sleep paralysis, that terrible feeling of being awake but unable to move, could be attributed to a Mara, a demon that sat on people's chests, suffocating them. High fever and delusions could be the result of a curse or the influence of a troll. This deep belief in the supernatural created a state of latent anxiety. Even if you were exhausted, your mind remained on guard against unseen threats. You slept with the awareness that the spirit world was active around you, and that you were vulnerable to its whims. There was not the sense of security that science and technology provide us today, the ability to explain the inexplicable and thus demystify fear. For us, a strange noise in the night can be the wind, an animal, or a neighbor. To a Viking, it could be an omen, a warning, or the arrival of an entity. And this interpretation, this layer of fear and superstition, prevented the mind from completely relaxing. Sleep was constantly interrupted by these fears, by these intrusive thoughts about what might be lurking in the darkness. There was no idea that a nightmare was just a product of his own mind. It was a real experience, an interaction with the spirit world. And this reality, this unshakable belief, made sleep a battleground not only against the physical, but also against the metaphysical. So the next time you lie in your bed, and maybe worry about a horror movie you watched, remember the Vikings. They didn't have the option to turn off the TV. They lived in a world where terror was real, and monsters were not just on screen but lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to manifest. Sleep, for them, was not the best in history. It was the sleep of superstition, a constant struggle against the demons of the mind and the unseen world. You are already writhing on the straw bed, your mind troubled by superstitions and your body troubled by parasites. But there's an added layer of physical torment that ensured that Viking sleep was an experience of constant pain, chronic injuries and persistent pain. Forget about your over-the-counter painkillers, your hot and cold compresses, or the possibility of corrective surgery. To a Viking, the body was a collection of scars, poorly healed fractures, and pain that refused to go away. Viking life was brutal. Not just the battles, but the daily work. Lifting stones, cutting wood, plowing the land, rowing for hours on end. All this took a toll. Fractures were common, and the medicine of the time was limited to immobilizing the limb and waiting for nature to do the rest. There were no orthopedic surgeons, no physiotherapists. A broken leg could consolidate crooked. A dislocated arm could never have the same mobility again. The result was chronic pain, grinding joints and muscles that protested with every movement. Imagine yourself lying down, trying to find a comfortable position, but every turn is a reminder of an old injury. That shoulder that was dislocated in a battle and never fully recovered, throbbing with the dampness of the night. That leg that was broken and is now shorter than the other, causing a constant imbalance and pain in the spine. That hand that was crushed and now hurts with the cold. There was no relief. No. Pain was a constant companion, a presence that intensified in the stillness of the night, when there were no distractions to divert attention. And it wasn't just the big injuries. Think about the small but persistent pains of everyday life. Calluses, blisters, ingrown toenails, cuts that became infected. Poor hygiene and the absence of antibiotics meant that a small wound could turn into a serious infection, causing fever, swelling, and excruciating pain. An infection in the tooth could spread to the jaw, causing a torment that lasted for days or weeks, with no hope of a dentist to extract the troublesome tooth. Arthritis and rheumatism were common companions in old age, but they could also affect younger people due to heavy lifting and constant exposure to cold and humidity. The joints swelled, became stiff and painful, especially after a day's work and in the stillness of the night. Trying to sleep with my joints on fire was an ordeal. For us, pain is a sign that something is wrong, and we seek immediate relief. We take a pill, apply an ointment, go to a doctor. To a Viking, pain was an intrinsic part of existence, a constant reminder of the harshness of life. They had neither the expectation of a life without pain, nor the means to relieve it. Sleep, which should be the great healer, became another battle. The body, already exhausted, was even more burdened by the struggle against pain. The mind, even though it wanted to rest, was constantly bombarded by signs of discomfort. This led to a fragmented, shallow sleep, where the body could never fully relax and recover. You woke up with the same pains, or perhaps with new pains, ready for another day of physical exertion. So the next time you feel a twinge in your back or a sore knee, and maybe think about taking a painkiller, remember the Vikings. They didn't have that option. They slept with their wounds and pains, and the night was just another battlefield where the body fought against its own limits. Sleep for them was not the best in history. It was the sleep of pain, a constant test of resilience in a world that offered no respite. You are already dealing with the symphony of aches, odors, and fears. But there is one luxury that you, with your single room and your door that locks, you consider an inalienable right, and that for a Viking was an unattainable fantasy: the lack of a room of your own. Forget the idea of a personal sanctuary, a haven where you can retreat from the world, meditate, read a book, or simply exist without the constant presence of others. For a Viking, life was an incessant communal experience, and this absence of individual space seeped deep into the quality of sleep. In the Viking Age, the longhouse was the center of life. It was the kitchen, the living room, the workshop, and the bedroom, all in one space. There were no internal walls, no divisions to create separate environments. The beds, as we have already mentioned, were platforms along the walls, where entire families slept side by side. There was no possibility of isolating oneself, of having a moment of introspection without being observed, heard, or at least perceived. Imagine the constant social surveillance. Every movement, every sound you made, was potentially noticed by dozens of other people. There was no luxury of a moment of privacy to process thoughts, to mourn in silence, or to simply be yourself without the social performance. This lack of a space for the mind to switch off from social mode was exhausting. For us, the bedroom is where we strip ourselves of the masks of the day, where we can be vulnerable and relax. For a Viking, this outlet simply did not exist. The impact on sleep was profound. The mind, even exhausted, could not completely shut down. There was a layer of constant alertness, a need to be aware of others, even in sleep. The neighbors snoring, the babies crying, the sound of someone getting up to go to the bathroom. All of this was part of her nighttime experience. There was no escaping the noise, the light, even if little, the central fire, or the simple physical presence of other bodies. For us, privacy is fundamental for intimacy and rest. The ability to have private conversations, to express emotions without judgment, to have moments of silence and solitude. For a Viking, all of this was a challenge. Marital intimacy, for example, had to be carried out with the awareness that there were others a few meters away. There was no luxury of a moment alone, which added a layer of stress and embarrassment that certainly did not contribute to a peaceful sleep. The absence of a room of their own also meant the absence of a space to store their personal belongings safely. Everything was shared, or was in plain sight. There was no sense of having a safe place for his most prized possessions, or for his most intimate memories. This lack of possession and control over one's own space contributed to a sense of vulnerability and lack of control, which extended until the moment of sleep. In contrast, you in your bedroom can close the door, turn on a soft light, and create an environment that is uniquely yours. You can read, listen to music, or simply enjoy the silence and solitude. For a Viking, this was an unattainable fantasy. They lived and slept in a human hive where individuality was often sacrificed for the sake of the community. So the next time you lie in your room and maybe complain about the mess or the color of the wall, remember the Vikings. They didn't have the option of a personal space. They slept in an environment where privacy was an unknown luxury, and the mind could never completely detach itself from the presence of others. Sleep for them was not the best in history. It was the sleep of forced communion, a shared experience that rarely offered the peace of solitude. You've spent the night on your straw bed, battling smoke, parasites, aches, fears, and lack of privacy. Maybe you've gotten a few fragments of sleep, interrupted by a crying baby or a mooing animal. But as soon as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the longhouse, or the rooster announced the new day with a shrill scream, there was no luxury of napping. For a Viking, the awakening was brutal, immediate, and without negotiation. Forget your alarm clock with soothing music or the possibility of hitting the snooze button for another 10 minutes of paradise. There were no alarm clocks. The clock was the sun and the necessities of survival. If you were a farmer, the countryside waited. If he was a fisherman, the tide did not wait. If he was a warrior, vigilance could not be relaxed. Viking life did not allow for the luxury of a gradual awakening. It was a direct leap from semi-unconsciousness to the harsh reality of the day. Imagine waking up to the biting chill of the morning, the smell of stagnant smoke and unwashed bodies. Your muscles are stiff, your joints hurt, and the exhaustion of the night before still weighs on you. There is no hot coffee to wake you up, nor an invigorating bath to prepare you for the day. You get up, perhaps with a yawn that turns into a cough due to the smoke, and immediately begin the day's tasks. The need to wake up early was imposed by the very nature of life. Animals needed to be fed. The fire needed to be revived. Water needed to be fetched. There was no option to work from home or have a day off. Every day was a struggle for survival, and every hour of daylight was too precious to be wasted on the luxury of a long sleep. Think about the contrast with your routine. You can adjust your sleep schedule, work late, and compensate on the weekend. For a Viking, the body was a working instrument and he needed to be ready for action as soon as the sun rose. Chronic sleep deprivation was not a choice. It was a condition of life. And this accumulated deprivation manifested itself in constant fatigue, irritability, and a diminished ability to concentrate. There was no idea of sleep hygiene or quality of life. There was only the need to survive. And to survive, you had to be awake and functional, even if your body and mind cried out for more rest. The awakening was a daily reminder of the harshness of life, the absence of luxuries, and the constant battle against the elements and basic needs. For us, dawn can be a moment of peace, reflection, and a quiet coffee. For a Viking, it was the signal to resume his work, to face another day of challenges. The body could be exhausted, but the mind needed to be alert, ready for the demands of the day. So the next time your alarm clock goes off and you feel that twinge of irritation at having to get out of your warm, comfy bed, remember the Vikings. They didn't have the option to postpone the inevitable. They woke up to a cold, noisy, demanding world without the promise of an easy day. Sleep, for them, was not the best in history. It was the sleep of need and the awakening, a daily test of resilience. You've been brutally pulled out of your fragmented slumber, but before you even went to bed, there was another factor that sabotaged any chance of a truly restful rest: mead and other alcoholic beverages. Forget the idea of a glass of warm milk or chamomile tea before bed. To a Viking, the night's drink was often fermented, and while it could induce a state of torpor, it was far from an elixir of sleep. Mead, ale, and to a lesser extent imported wine, were common beverages in the Viking Age. They were not just for parties and celebrations. They were an integral part of the daily diet. Drinking water was not always safe, and the fermentation process made alcoholic beverages safer to consume, as well as providing calories and, of course, a certain relief from the hardships of life. Imagine an exhausting day at work, a sore body, an anxious mind. A good sip of mead could seem like the perfect solution to relax and forget about problems. And indeed, alcohol has an initial sedative effect. It can make you feel sleepy and fall asleep faster. For a Viking who didn't have access to sleeping pills or an understanding of the neurochemistry of sleep, this feeling of disconnection was probably welcome. You drank, you felt the heat spread through your body, and the world seemed a little less harsh. Exhaustion and alcohol combined to bring him down. But here's the dirty trick of alcohol. It's a false friend of sleep. While it can induce early sleep, it drastically disrupts sleep cycles later in the night. Alcohol suppresses REM, rapid eye movement. Sleep, the most restorative and dreamy phase of sleep. Instead of a deep, continuous sleep, you experienced a fragmented sleep, full of micro-awakenings where the body could never reach true rest. Imagine yourself falling asleep quickly after a few pints of mead, but a few hours later, the alcohol begins to metabolize, and your body goes into a state of alertness. Your heart may race, you may sweat, and your mind may start racing. You wake up perhaps with a full bladder. Alcohol is a diuretic to your bad luck, and the need to get up in the middle of the night to face the cold and darkness. And once awake, going back to sleep becomes an arduous task, as the initial sedative effect is already gone, and the body is in a rebound state. Additionally, excessive alcohol consumption can lead to more vivid and disturbing nightmares, especially when the body tries to compensate for REM sleep suppression. Those warriors who were already suffering from battle trauma and anxiety, by adding alcohol to the mix, were only intensifying their nightly torments. There was no understanding that alcohol, although it might seem like a shortcut to sleep, actually robbed it of its most essential quality. They didn't have the science to explain why, despite sleeping for hours, they woke up even more tired, irritable, and with the feeling that they hadn't really rested. For us today, the recommendation is clear. Avoid alcohol before bed if you're looking for quality sleep. To a Viking, this information was unknown, and mead was an accepted, even celebrated part of life. What they thought was a sleep aid was actually more of an obstacle. So the next time you think of a drink to relax before bed, remember the Vikings. They used alcohol to numb reality, but they paid the price with nights of fragmented and non-restorative sleep. Sleep for them was not the best in history. It was the sleep of alcohol, an illusion of rest that left the body and mind even more exhausted. You've experienced the smoke, the parasites, the aches, the fears, the lack of privacy, the cold, the rocking of the ship, the constant vigilance, the odors, and even the treacherous effects of mead. But there is one last and perhaps most fundamental of the factors that prevented Viking sleep from being anything remotely resembling the best in history: the complete and utter non-existence of sleep science. Forget your studies on REM and non-REM cycles, your sleep monitoring apps, your books on sleep hygiene, and your sleep disorder experts. To a Viking, sleep was a mystery, a biological necessity that just happened or didn't, without any understanding of how to optimize or improve it. In the Viking Age, sleep was not a field of study. There were no researchers observing brainwave patterns, no doctors prescribing sleep routines. The understanding of the human body was rudimentary, and the mind a realm of mysteries and superstitions. Sleep was perhaps seen as a state of rest, a necessary pause between activities, but not as a complex process with distinct phases and vital functions for physical and mental health. This meant that there was no advice on how to create an environment conducive to sleep. No one would tell them to keep the room dark, cool, and quiet. On the contrary, they slept in noisy, smoky environments with irregular temperatures. There was no idea that exposure to blue light before bed could disrupt the circadian rhythm, or that a heavy meal could cause nighttime indigestion. They simply ate what they had and slept where they could. The lack of knowledge about sleep hygiene was glaring. No one would tell them to avoid alcohol before bed, or to establish a regular sleep routine. No one would explain to them that chronic sleep deprivation could lead to health problems, decreased cognitive ability, or increased irritability. They lived the consequences without understanding the causes. Fatigue was a constant and accepted part of life, not a symptom of inadequate sleep. Think of the irony. Today, with all our knowledge and technology, we still struggle to sleep well. We have state-of-the-art mattresses, ergonomic pillows, apps that monitor our every heartbeat and every movement. We have therapies, medications, and a plethora of advice on how to achieve perfect sleep. And yet many of us still feel exhausted. For a Viking, this fight was even more unequal. They didn't have the tools, knowledge, or infrastructure to even begin to address sleep issues. They were at the mercy of their bodies, their environments, and their circumstances, without any scientific guidance or understanding. Sleep was a lottery, and most of them lost. The absence of a vocabulary to describe sleep disorders meant that problems such as chronic insomnia, sleep apnea, or restless leg syndrome were simply part of life, with no diagnosis or treatment. You simply slept poorly, and that was all. There was no hope that things could get better, or that there would be a solution to his nightly torment. So the next time you lie down in your bed and maybe check your sleep app to see how your night went, remember the Vikings. They didn't have the science to understand what was happening to their bodies and minds during sleep. They lived in a world where sleep was a mystery, and the quality of rest was a matter of luck. Sleep for them was not the best in history. It was the sleep of ignorance, a battle fought in the dark without a map or compass. You've walked the tortuous path of Viking sleep, from the choking smoke of the longhouse to the nightmares of battle, to the parasites, the chronic pains, the constant fear, the absence of privacy, the unforgiving cold of winter, the treacherous rocking of the ship, the pungent odors, the deceptive effects of mead, and the complete ignorance of the science of sleep. Now we come to the inevitable conclusion, the legacy of restless sleep. The idea that the Vikings enjoyed the best sleep in history is, as we have seen, a cruel romanticization. It was not a sleep of kings, nor of invincible warriors who magically recovered from their exploits. It was a sleep of survival, a constant struggle against a hostile environment, a sore body, and an anxious mind. Each night was a test of endurance, a test of how little rest the human body could endure before giving in. They did not sleep soundly because they were at peace. They slept because they were exhausted. Exhaustion was his sleeping pill, his anesthesia. But even this exhaustion did not guarantee restful sleep. It was a fragmented, superficial sleep, constantly interrupted by internal and external threats. They woke up more tired than when they went to sleep, their nerves on edge, ready for another day of toil and danger. Viking life was an existence of deprivation. Deprivation of comfort, safety, hygiene, knowledge, and this deprivation extended to sleep. There was no luxury of an optimized environment for rest, nor the understanding of how sleep affects health and well-being. Sleep was a biological need that had to be fitted among the demands of survival, and not a fundamental pillar for a healthy life. Think about the long-term consequences of this chronic sleep deprivation: the constant irritability, the decreased ability to concentrate, the fatigue that infiltrated every aspect of life. Their physical and mental health was compromised, making them more susceptible to illness, accidents, and impulsive decisions. What today we would call bad mood or lack of focus was, for them, a condition of life. The legacy of Viking sleep is not one of tranquility but of resilience. They persisted. They built empires. They explored the world, all while struggling with sleep that was, at best, inadequate. It makes us question our own fragility, our dependence on so many comforts to achieve what they could hardly dream of. So the next time you lie down in your soft bed, in your quiet, dark room, and still have trouble sleeping, remember the Vikings. They had none of that. And yet, they lived. Sleep, for them, was not the best in history. It was the sleep of struggle, a daily and nightly battle for survival in a world that offered no respite. And that's why, instead of envying your supposed sleep, we should be grateful for every minute of rest we have. And now, my dear listener, as the last words of this monotonous story dissipate into thin air, feel the weight of your eyelids. The Viking world, with its smoke, its noises, and its fears, is receding, becoming only a distant echo. You are safe, warm, and the only sound that matters now is that of your own breathing, slow and deep. Think of your soft bed, your pillow that hugs your head, the silence that surrounds you. There are no rats scratching against the walls, nor the howling of the icy wind. There is no threat of invaders, nor the pain of old wounds. Only peace. Let the darkness envelop you, not as a danger, but as a cloak of tranquility. Every muscle in your body relaxes. Every thought dissolves. The past is past, and the present is only the gentle rocking of your own sleep. Let the exhaustion of the day take you, not to a fragmented sleep, but to a deep and restful rest. You deserve it. You have the luxury that the Vikings never knew. Take a deep breath, release all the air, and feel yourself sink into a sleep without worries, without fears, without smoke.